Why did Germany invade the Soviet Union in 1941? The simple answer you learned in school is probably Lebensraum, or living space. But that's just scratching the surface of a much deeper, more complex story. The real reasons are a chilling cocktail of ideology, economics, and raw ambition. Let's peel back the layers and uncover the truth behind Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest and most devastating military operations in human history. To truly understand this monumental decision, we have to step inside the mind of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi elite. At the core of their worldview was a deeply ingrained, almost fanatical hatred of both communism and what they called Judeo-Bolshevism. They saw the Soviet Union not just as a political rival, but as the physical embodiment of their greatest ideological enemy. In Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, he laid it all out. He believed that the Slavic peoples were an inferior race, destined to be subjugated or eliminated, and that their vast lands in the East were Germany's rightful inheritance. This wasn't just a political goal. For the Nazis, it was a racial crusade, a holy war to cleanse the world of a system they despised and seize the territory they believed was their destiny. They imagined a future where German colonists would lord over a vast agricultural empire, built on the backs of enslaved local populations. This ideological fanaticism was the primary engine driving the entire invasion plan. It wasn't just about land, it was about annihilation and replacement. But ideology alone doesn't start a war of this scale. You need resources, and Germany was desperately short of them. The German war machine, as powerful as it was, had a critical weakness. It was almost entirely dependent on imported oil. In 1940, over 85% of Germany's oil supply came from foreign sources, primarily Romania and, ironically, the Soviet Union itself. This made Germany incredibly vulnerable. The British naval blockade was already strangling its access to overseas resources. Hitler knew that to win a prolonged war, especially against the British Empire and potentially the United States, he needed a secure, independent supply of raw materials. And where could he find them in abundance? The Soviet Union. The calculus was brutal and straightforward. The Baku oil fields in the Caucasus region were one of the largest sources of oil in the world. Capturing them would solve Germany's fuel crisis in one fell swoop and simultaneously cripple the Soviet war effort. But it wasn't just about oil. The Donetsk Basin in Ukraine was rich with coal and iron ore, essential for steel production. Ukraine itself was the breadbasket of Europe, a vast expanse of fertile land that could feed the German population and army, making the nation immune to any blockade. So, the invasion was also a colossal resource grab. Hitler gambled that a swift victory would give him the oil, grain, and minerals needed to defeat Britain and establish a self-sufficient German empire, a 1,000-year Reich that could dominate Europe for centuries. The economic motives were just as powerful as the ideological ones. They were two sides of the same coin. So if the invasion was so crucial, why did Hitler sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin just 2 years earlier in 1939? This is where the story gets really interesting. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was never meant to be a lasting peace. For Hitler, it was a purely tactical maneuver. He needed to neutralize the Soviet Union temporarily so he could focus his forces on conquering Poland, and then Western Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, without having to fight a war on two fronts. He was essentially buying time. He knew he would eventually turn on Stalin, but he had to deal with his enemies in the West first. For Stalin, the pact was also a cynical move. He didn't trust Hitler at all, but he hoped the pact would give the Soviet Union several years to rebuild its military, which had been decimated by his own purges in the late 1930s. He also hoped that Germany and the Western Allies would exhaust each other in a long, drawn-out war, leaving the Soviet Union as the dominant power in Europe. Both leaders were trying to outmaneuver the other, each believing they had secured a vital advantage. The pact was a temporary truce in a conflict that both sides knew was inevitable. By the summer of 1940, Hitler's plan seemed to be working perfectly. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. The German army looked invincible. This string of stunning victories created a dangerous sense of overconfidence within the German high command. They began to believe their own propaganda. They thought the Wehrmacht was an unstoppable force, and that the Red Army, which had performed poorly against Finland in the recent Winter War, would collapse under the first major assault. German military planners famously predicted that the Soviet Union would be defeated in just 8 to 10 weeks, before the harsh Russian winter even set in. They called it a blitzkrieg, a lightning war. This arrogance led to catastrophic miscalculations. They severely underestimated the sheer size of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the vastness of its industrial capacity, much of which was located deep in the interior, beyond the reach of the initial German advance. They also failed to properly equip their soldiers for the brutal Russian winter, a mistake that would have horrifying consequences. As the planned invasion date of June 22, 1941, approached, Stalin received a flood of intelligence warnings. His own spies, including the legendary Richard Sorge in Tokyo, as well as British and American intelligence, all sent urgent messages confirming that a massive German invasion was imminent. They reported the buildup of millions of German troops, tanks, and aircraft along the Soviet border. But Stalin, in one of the most fateful decisions of the 20th century, refused to believe it. Why? It's a question historians still debate. Perhaps he was so convinced of his own strategic genius in signing the pact that he couldn't accept he had been duped. Perhaps he feared that any defensive preparations on his part would be seen as a provocation by Hitler, giving the Germans an excuse to attack. Or maybe he was simply paralyzed by fear and denial. Whatever the reason, he ordered his generals not to put their troops on high alert. When the invasion finally came, the Red Army was caught completely by surprise, leading to catastrophic initial losses. So, when we ask why Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the answer isn't a single reason. It was a perfect storm of factors. It was a war born from a toxic racial ideology that demanded conquest and extermination. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble for the resources, oil, grain, and minerals, needed to fuel a global war machine and create a self-sufficient empire. It was driven by a sense of military invincibility and a gross underestimation of the enemy. And it was enabled by the cynical diplomacy and fatal miscalculations of both dictators, Hitler and Stalin, who were locked in a deadly game of chess where the pawns were millions of human lives. The invasion wasn't just another battle, it was the collision of two totalitarian ideologies, a turning point in World War II that would ultimately seal the fate of the Third Reich and reshape the world map for the next half-century. Thank you so much for watching. Understanding these complex historical events helps us grasp the world we live in today. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. We'll see you in the next one.